On Tuesday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced the House is moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry of United States President Donald J. Trump. If an impeachment were to occur, it would be only the third time in the nation's history a president has been impeached. The other two, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, were acquitted after trial before the Senate. Pelosi made the statement at about 5 p.m. Tuesday afternoon.
Last Tuesday, we observed the anniversary of the adoption of the Constitution on September 17th. Sadly, on that day, the Intelligence Community Inspector General formally notified the Congress that the administration was forbidding him from turning over a whistleblower complaint on Constitution Day. This is a violation of law. Shortly thereafter, press reports began to break of a phone call by the President of the United States calling upon a foreign power to intervene in his election. This is a breach of his constitutional responsibilities. The facts are these. The Intelligence Community Inspector General, who was appointed by President Trump, determined that the complaint is both of urgent concern and credible. And its disclosure, he went on to say, relates to one of the most significant and important of the Director of National Intelligence's responsibility to the American people. On Thursday, the Inspector General testified before the House Intelligence Committee stating that the acting Director of National Intelligence blocked him from disclosing the whistleblower complaint. This is a violation of law. The law is unequivocal. The DNI staff, it says the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, shall provide Congress the full whistleblower complaint. For more than 25 years, I've served on the Intelligence Committee as a member, as the ranking member, as part of the Gang of Four, even before I was in the leadership. I was there when we created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. That did not exist before 2004. I was there even earlier in the 90s when we wrote the whistleblower laws and continue to write them to improve them to ensure the security of our intelligence and the safety of our whistleblowers. I know what their purpose was, and we proceeded with balance and caution as we wrote the laws. I can say with authority the Trump administration's actions undermine both our national security and our intelligence and our protections of the whistleblowers, more than both. This Thursday, the acting DNI will appear before the House Intelligence Committee. At that time, he must turn over the whistleblower's full complaint to the committee. He will have to choose whether to break the law or honor his responsibility to the Constitution. On the final day of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, when our Constitution was adopted, Americans gathered on the steps of Independence Hall to await the news of the government our founders had crafted. They asked Benjamin Franklin, "What do we have, a republic or a monarchy?" Franklin replied, "A republic if you can keep it." Our responsibility is to keep it. Our republic endures because of the wisdom of our Constitution, enshrined in three co-equal branches of government, serving as checks and balances on each other. The actions taken to date by the President have seriously violated the Constitution, especially when the President says, Article 2 says I can do whatever I want. For the past several months, we have been investigating in our committees and litigating in the courts, so the House can gather all the relevant facts and consider whether to exercise its full Article 1 powers, including a constitutional power of the utmost gravity, approval of articles of impeachment. And this week, the President has admitted to asking the President of Ukraine to take actions which would benefit him politically. The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the President's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections. Therefore, today, I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. I'm directing our 6 committees to proceed with their investigations under that umbrella of impeachment inquiry. The President must be held accountable. No one is above the law. Getting back to our founders, in the darkest days of the American Revolution, Thomas Paine wrote, "The times have found us. The times found them to fight for and establish our democracy. The times have found us today, not to place ourselves in the same category of greatness as our founders, but to place us in the urgency of protecting and defending our Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic." In the words of Ben Franklin, to keep our republic. I thank our chairman, Chairman Nadler, Chairman Nadler of Judiciary, Chairman Schiff of Intelligence, Chairman Engel of Foreign Affairs, Chairman Cummings of Oversight, and Chairman Cummings I've been in touch with constantly. He's a master of so much, but including inspectors general and whistleblowers. Congresswoman Richie Neal of the Ways and Means Committee, Congresswoman Maxine Waters of the Foreign Financial Services Committee. And I commend all of our members, our colleagues, for their thoughtful approach to all of this, for their careful statements. God bless them, and God bless America. Thank you all.
Madam Speaker.
And President Trump fired off 3 tweets within moments of Pelosi's statement. He tweeted, "Presidential harassment," in all caps and an exclamation mark, followed 4 minutes later by, "They never even saw the transcript of the call, a total witch hunt." And Pelosi, Nadler, Schiff, and of course Maxine Waters. Can you believe this? A moment later, Trump tweeted a video of a 90-second campaign spot attacking the Democrats.
Do you personally think impeachment should be considered?
I think it should.
As we begin impeachment proceedings now.
And that we've got to impeach him and get rid of him.
My sole focus right now is to make sure that he's not the president next term. My sole focus.
We're going to go in there, we're going to impeach the motherfucker.
We're going to launch an Article 3 impeachment.
In the question of impeachment, it's about time.
Nadler is, I hope he's not following the rules. Congress should take the steps towards impeachment.
We're going to have to prosecute this.
We're going to have to do it. We're going to have to impeach.
Impeachment is still on the table?
Absolutely. It's always on the table.
We cannot accept a second term for Donald Trump.
If we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected.
It's time to stop this nonsense. They think they're going to win. Did you see the one man? He said it's the only way we're going to beat him in 2020. They have to do this. The only way well, that's a compliment, I guess. But think of what he said. It's the only way they're going to beat me. And actually, it's working the other way, because now we have our best poll numbers that we've ever had. It's crazy. It's crazy.
And that was the new ad just released moments ago by President Trump on his Twitter feed. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy was scheduled to respond from the Capitol Rotunda at any moment. And the United States Senate opened its own investigation into the Trump administration's dealings with Ukraine on Tuesday. The Senate Intelligence Committee is conducting the inquiry and is seeking an interview with the whistleblower who filed the initial complaint with the intelligence community's Inspector General. It was not immediately clear whether the White House will agree to let the official be questioned. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff said the whistleblower's lawyer informed him the official would, quote, like to speak to our committee and has requested guidance from the acting Director of National Intelligence on his appearance, which could come as soon as this week. The acting head of National Intelligence, Trump appointee Joseph McGuire, has refused to hand over the complaint to Congress, but is slated to appear before Schiff's committee on Thursday. And Daniel Ellsberg, the former defense analyst and whistleblower who leaked the Pentagon Papers, the secret State Department review of the Vietnam War that showed the government knew the conflict was a lost cause, even as they were telling Americans they were on the verge of winning, has a statement to make himself. Facing a century in prison, Ellsberg gave reporters for the Washington Post and New York Times copies of the documents that were soon published. Criminal charges against Ellsberg were dropped when it was discovered the administration of President Richard Nixon had been spying on him and had broken into the offices of his psychiatrist looking for dirt. Ellsberg says the whistleblower who made the complaint about Trump's conversation with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is facing a moment when courage means everything.
I have, of course, been in the position of this whistleblower, whoever she is or he is, okay? And I had similar choices to make. Now, in this case, the whistleblower, we'll just say they, has chosen to work entirely at first through channels, doing what the whistleblower laws require and what their own safety from prosecution requires. In other words, the whistleblower so far is safe from prosecution because they have done what the law demands, and that is that they go to the Inspector General, that they complain to their own bosses, they go to the Inspector General, and they rely on him to inform Congress of their information, complaint, accusation, if he judges it to be urgent and credible, as he has. Now, so far, that whistleblower has taken no risks of prosecution, although genuine risks of a career if their identity becomes known, which in the past has been likely to happen, and they suffer for it. So the whistleblower has already shown some real courage and patriotism here in taking a risk. However, it has not informed the Congress or the public. The Director of Central Intelligence has yielded here to a judgment from the Trump Office of Legal Counsel, the Trump Justice Department, which has generally up to now looked pretty corrupt, as acting almost as a personal lawyer for the president in the face of credible evidence of presidential malfeasance. What should the whistleblower do at this point? If it is as important in her eyes or his eyes as she appears to think so far, then I would say, from my own experience and judgment, let's call her she, but they should strongly consider risking her own freedom, her own career, her own reputation to inform the public, to inform the Congress, to enable them to fulfill their constitutional obligations by going to Congress directly, revealing herself, going to Congress directly, and if Congress holds it up, telling the public. In fact, I would say go to the media at the same time as the Congress under these circumstances. I would not advise the whistleblower to short-circuit the congressional process here, and I would wait, if I were her or him, to see if Congress can't use its own constitutional powers to get that information. But if they fail, as they have so far, if they continue to fail, then go to them directly and go to the press directly and inform the public. The price may be very large. Personally, I faced a possible sentence of 115 years for doing that, and I took that risk, and I think I was right to do so. And Ed Snowden has accepted permanent exile, essentially, for having informed the public of criminal action by the National Security Council. National Security Agency, NSA. Clearly criminal. Chelsea Manning revealed clearly criminal activity in terms of torture, and paid for that with 7.5 years in prison. Yes, this person could be risking a prison sentence. Not certain, because it's clearly right for her to reveal criminality if she believes that has occurred and has evidence for it, but by the president. But she would do that at her own risk, and what I'm saying is that risk could be worth taking and could be very beneficial to our democracy. So I'm not aware of anybody else, and I'm the one who's in best position to raise that issue right now. What the whistleblower should do or should consider doing if Congress fails to get this information, and not only the transcription of this call, which the president may deliver, but all of the acts that the whistleblower has alluded to that seem to reveal a pattern of criminality.
Ellsberg adds that Nixon considered destroying the incriminating tapes he had made of White House meetings when the House began its impeachment investigation of the Watergate break-in and its cover-up. Ellsberg says Trump is just as capable of destroying evidence.
Is it beyond question that he would clearly obstruct justice or clearly violate the Constitution here by just destroying evidence that the House has asked for and is entitled to get? Well, of course he might do that. You can't put any limit, I would say any limit at all, on what he might do to preserve his reputation. He doesn't care that much about his reputation with people other than his base, but to keep in office and to avoid prosecution, he is very concerned. So, of course, he might do that. And as I say, Nixon might very well have gotten away with that, and he would probably get away with it in terms of the Senate. The Republicans so far, as I can see, have not shown the slightest willingness to hold him accountable to the Constitution or to the law. In effect, they are enabling and abetting a strict violation of the Constitution. And they should be ashamed, but then we have a president who is shameless, and it might appear that the Republicans in the House, in the Senate, are equally shameless, and for that matter, in the House. They haven't joined us in the House so far. That, again, has slowed up Pelosi to this point. She wanted it to be a bipartisan matter, and so far there's no prospect of that. But because the Republicans in the House, as well as the Senate, are both shameless and lawless, they have no instinct at all, apparently, to uphold the law or the Constitution here. But that puts it on the Democrats to protect the Constitution and the power of Congress, and it seems as though at last they're stepping up to that.
Ellsberg gives a history lesson describing how Watergate unfolded after the Saturday night massacre when Nixon ordered the firing of the special prosecutor investigating Watergate. He said it parallels the case against Trump.
Attorney General Elliot Richardson refused to do that and had to resign or was fired. He was replaced by Ruckelshaus, who also refused to fire the special prosecutor. And the issue there was whether they would get the tapes. Then when, because of enormous public protest, at that point, what was known as the against what was known as the Saturday Night Massacre, there was what Haig called a firestorm of protest, of telegrams and phone calls at that time. And he really had to hire another special prosecutor, after all, who in turn demanded the tapes. And that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ordered him to comply, and at that point it wasn't quite clear whether it was in question whether Nixon would actually comply with that or not. But in the end, after some hesitation, he did say he would comply with the Supreme Court. And notice the Supreme Court got into it. In this case, so far, no court has ruled on it. But in short, over and over again in Watergate, there was very much the president resisted very strongly giving various documents over to Congress, and in the end capitulated, and that led to his facing impeachment, and he resigned instead of putting the country through an impeachment process which he was almost sure to lose. Now, a big difference there is that he would have lost in the Senate then with the help of Republicans who would have turned against him. Senator Goldwater and others told him that Republicans would vote against him in the Senate. We have no such indication now. So in this case, the president can feel quite assured that he will not actually be convicted. But at the same point, he would be impeached, which is like indictment, but he wouldn't be convicted. However, the process of the impeachment would almost surely bring out evidence, that would impugn him very seriously, would probably incriminate him. And even though the Senate then acquitted him, the question is how that would affect voters, and would it bring Republican voters to the polls in such numbers as to reelect him? That's obviously what Nancy Pelosi worries about. But we do have a question there where if you don't impeach him, the House is, in hopes of an electoral result, is ignoring or passing up very clear violations of his oath of office and the Constitution. It appears that the Democrats are now ready to take whatever risk there is in impeaching him in terms of the election in order to take a stand.
And Daniel Ellsberg is the former defense analyst and whistleblower who leaked the Pentagon Papers, the secret State Department review of the Vietnam War. And you're listening to the news on WBAI Pacifica Radio in New York. I'm Paul DiRienzo. Freedom of Information Act files released to the Guardian newspaper show the FBI has embarked on anti-terrorism-style investigations against environmental activists in the United States. The Guardian says hundreds of pages of documents it received showed more than a dozen activists had come under FBI scrutiny in cases opened in 2013 and 2014 at the height of opposition to fossil fuel expansion projects. The government's targeting of protesters occurred despite 2010 criticisms of the FBI's practices by the Department of Justice Inspector General. In 2015, the Obama administration rejected the Keystone XL pipeline project, which required State Department approval because it would cross international borders, handing the environmental movement a major victory. Donald Trump has subsequently approved construction of the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines, and his administration has also advocated for stiffer penalties against activists who engage in nonviolent direct action targeting fossil fuel infrastructure. The FBI files showed a concerted campaign against the Idaho-based group protesting so-called megaload transport of equipment destined for Canadian oil shale fields. An organizer with the group was put on a watch list, a common occurrence in an FBI domestic terrorism investigation. The U.S. Justice Department unveiled 17 new criminal charges against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange on Thursday, saying he unlawfully published the names of classified sources and conspired with and assisted ex-Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning in obtaining access to classified information. The superseding indictment comes a little more than a month after the Justice Department unsealed a narrower criminal case against Assange. Assange was initially charged with conspiring with Manning to gain access to a government computer as part of a 2010 leak by WikiLeaks of hundreds of thousands of U.S. military reports about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The decision to charge Assange with espionage crimes is notable and unusual. Most cases involving the theft of classified information have targeted government employees like Manning and not the people who published the information itself. The secret document that Assange published was provided by the former Army intelligence analyst who was convicted at a court-martial trial in 2013 of leaking the records. The Justice Department's decision to pursue Espionage Act charges signals a dramatic escalation under President Trump to crack down on leaks of classified information and aims squarely at First Amendment protections for journalists. Most recently, law enforcement officials charged a former intelligence analyst with giving classified documents to The Intercept, a national security news website. The government has never charged a journalist under the Espionage Act. The New York Times wrote Thursday in response to the indictments against Assange that though he is not a conventional journalist, much of what Mr. Assange does at WikiLeaks is difficult to distinguish in legally meaningful ways from what traditional news organizations like the New York Times do. The Obama administration had considered charging Assange under the Espionage Act, but never did out of concerns that such a case would chill traditional journalism. The Espionage Act is a law that was passed in 1917. It was intended to prohibit interference with military operations or recruitment, to prevent insubordination in the military, and to prevent the support of United States enemies during wartime. Among those charged with offenses under the act are German-American Socialist Congressman and newspaper editor Victor Ellsberg, labor leader and five-time Socialist Party of America candidate Eugene V. Debs, anarchist Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, former Watchtower Bible and Tract Society president Joseph Franklin Rutherford, and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The Rosenbergs were eventually executed under another law, the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which made passing nuclear secrets to a foreign government punishable by death. The law was amended in 1954 to eliminate the death penalty. The first journalism source charged under the law was Daniel Ellsberg. Charges against him were eventually dropped when it was revealed that the Nixon administration had been spying on him.
This is an attack directly on the First Amendment and on journalism in America, and it will have precedence for the whole world. I've expected this whenever Julian Assange got extradited to this country, if he did, and with the appeals going on that, I expected that to be a year or even two from now, perhaps after he'd gone to Sweden. But instead, it's coming right now. The reason I didn't expect this attack on by using the Espionage Act so soon was that will definitely complicate a decision and the appeals of extraditing him from Britain, because the extradition treaty there has a clause that they're not to extradite anyone for political cause, a political offense. And this is very clearly what this is. Well, we'll see whether the UK is concerned about that or not. And then there'll be a question of Sweden's claim. And again, they're not supposed to extradite for a political offense. So this complicates the question of extradition. But if and when he is extradited to the United States to face these counts, he will be the first person, and he's not an American citizen, of course, to start with, but he will be the first journalist ever to be indicted in the United States for giving information to the American public. I was the first source, a former official, to be tried under the Espionage Act. I faced 12 counts, including one of conspiracy, facing 115 years. He's facing 17 counts under the Espionage Act and one for conspiracy, so he's facing 175 years. Frankly, as a former defendant, that doesn't make much difference. It's a life sentence, whichever you're looking at, even with good behavior. So they're trying to put a journalist in prison for releasing information to the American public, which could not be a more direct violation of the First Amendment, the freedom of the press. It makes a mockery of the First Amendment, which is the absolute foundation stone of this republic, of this democracy over here. And it deserves the highest priority attention from everyone in the press, but actually from people concerned with civil liberties in this country at all. It certainly concerns me. I'm 88 years old. I didn't expect really to be spending all my time on this case or a case like this, but I'll have to, because, as I say, my experience of being the first person prosecuted under this has given me an understanding of this particular law, 18 U.S.C. 793, paragraphs D and E, which I happen to know as a non-lawyer because I was the first defendant under it. And it's been used now by, let's see how many, about a dozen people since me, nine of them under President Obama, more than the three previous presidents combined. But Obama studied DOJ studied the Assange case, wanted to use him as a precedent, really, I think, for getting at journalists, and yet decided not to do it over a matter since 2010. Now that's 9 years ago, because it was so blatant a violation of the First Amendment, and they weren't sure that wouldn't be noticed by appeals court and by the Supreme Court. So they were afraid that it would chill journalism, which it obviously is intended to do and will do, even the prosecution, whether he's convicted or not. As of this hour and today, every journalist in America now knows that for the first time they are vulnerable to criminal prosecution for doing their job. The law was intended to be used against spies and has been used exclusively for that reason until my case, 1971, when I was indicted not as a spy. In fact, the prosecution made a motion, which was accepted, not to use the word espionage in the courtroom because it would prejudice the case against him. It was so obvious that what I was doing in revealing thousands of pages, 7,000 pages of top secret documents to the public was not done with the intention of helping a foreign power in a war or not in a war, but in intention of helping our democracy discover lies by the government over a 23-year period at that point. So they didn't even want to, they didn't want the jury to think, well, this guy's obviously not a spy. They didn't charge me with that. It was the first non-espionage case. This, too, is a non-espionage case, but it's against a journalist, not a source. And even Nixon did not, in the end, try to prosecute the New York Times. The New York Times itself acknowledges, today, I just saw it, that what Julian Assange did was essentially what the New York Times does all the time. In other words, for all the efforts of this Justice Department, a guy named John Damer apparently, to distinguish Julian Assange from journalists and publishers, and what he did from what, quote, responsible journalists do, they're charging him with what journalists do all the time, in part for requesting and soliciting classified information. Well, I couldn't count the number of times I have been solicited for classified information over the years, and 1,000 other people have, by the Times, the Post, the AP, whoever else. That's what journalists do. And they've never been prosecuted for it before because you can't have a free press that is subject to criminal charges for that. You ask what the intent of the law was. It was, by all the legislative history, that is the discussion in Congress when it was passed in 1917, just after war had been declared against, it was to get German spies then, and any kind of spies, even friendly spies from friendly countries like Israel. Jonathan Pollard is in prison still for having information to Israel. And to use that against a source of information to the American public, and I have to keep saying over and over, I was the first, is to define the American public pretty much as the enemy, which is the way the executive branch of which I was part for a long time sees the public, but they don't come right out in court and say it. And so Trump is breaking that tradition of non-violating the First Amendment on that condition. That's today. It's a historic day and a very ominous one. He is doing what Nixon actually contemplated doing, going directly after publishers and journalists and not just their sources. Nixon actually was considering, in fact, had a grand jury, let me just say, not considering. There was a grand jury that was going after Neil Sheehan and Hedrick Smith, who helped publish the Pentagon Papers, both of the New York Times. And actually their lawyer expected them to be indicted. But the conditions under which my prosecution was dismissed finally in May of '73 of illegally overhearing me on warrantless wiretaps and taking attempts to kill me on May 3rd, 1972, and burglarizing my psychiatrist's office and so forth. All of those things prejudiced the prosecution of the people who had published what I gave them, that grand jury was dropped. As far as I know, that's the first and last time that they got that close to prosecuting a journalist until now. Obama, as I just said, considered it for years, since 2010, and decided not to do it, that they would lose in any way, would chill journalism, which their Department of Justice purported not to want to do. They were already chilling journalism by prosecuting sources, frankly, but this one they were going to lose because it's so clearly a violation, a misuse of the Espionage Act, as is this case, an even more blatant, unconstitutional misuse of the Espionage Act. You asked what the difference was between Trump and Nixon. Nixon was faced impeachment for violating the Constitution and a number of criminal acts against me as a source. Trump is even more blatant about violating the Constitution than Richard Nixon. Is that a surprise? I don't suppose so. But it's a terrible precedent, and he will not be the last to do this if he gets away with it. This case should be demanded that on constitutional grounds, this case should be dropped. And really, the Attorney General should be subject to impeachment for bringing this case at all. Yes, it should be another count in impeachment proceedings if those go against Trump.
And that's Daniel Ellsberg, who was charged under the Espionage Act for revealing the Pentagon Papers to the Washington Post, charges that were eventually dropped. A former New York Times reporter and columnist for TruthDig.com is Chris Hedges.
This is part of the preordained judicial lynching of Julian Assange. I think no one expected that the first public charge of hacking or assisting Chelsea Manning into the hacking of a government computer was the end of it. I think all of us expected the Espionage Act to be used, although we must be clear that Julian Assange is not an American citizen, and WikiLeaks is not a U.S.-based news organization. So the very use of the Espionage Act against Julian Assange, who is an Australian citizen and had been an Ecuadorian citizen until Lenin Moreno revoked the citizenship, is just another example of judicial overreach and the extent to which the empire will go to persecute those journalists, or in Assange's case, publishers, who expose the inner workings and the crimes of empire. That's what this is about. It is a very ominous day for the press. They will hardly stop with Assange. The failure on the part of established media organizations like the New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, all of whom printed over the course of several days the revelations provided by WikiLeaks, is extremely short-sighted because none of this is about espionage. None of this is about manipulation by a foreign power. What this is about is the ability of the empire, the American empire, to create a kind of cone of silence so that its activities, its crimes, including war crimes, its fraud, its anti-democratic efforts around the world to install puppets and client regimes, is hidden from public view. That's what this is about, and it's accompanied by terrible forms of character assassination. I know Julian pretty well. We all have flaws, and he's no exception. But he's not being persecuted for his vices. He's being persecuted for his virtues.
What is the antidote to this? What is it possible that that people should do in response to this?
Well, I'm flying to London for the final hearing on June 12th, and I think we have to make our voices heard, especially journalists have to decry what's happening and the persecution and the attempt to, in essence, end investigative journalism into the sources of power. That doesn't mean we will succeed, but we have a moral obligation to decry what's happening and to be heard. So I'll be at the courthouse. I will certainly am holding events in London with George Galloway and others. We can't be silent because this is the first step, and those of us who attempt to continue in the tradition of investigative journalism that isn't co-opted by corporate or imperial power, we're next.
And what's happening on June 12th exactly?
Well, this is his hearing over the extradition. And unfortunately, the comments by the judge show that the British judicial system has been as co-opted as our own. But yeah, it's about whether he will be extradited. And of course, this has long been the goal of the American state, and how they've been working for many years on this, along with the British government, so that he will be shackled and have a hood put over his head and stuffed on a CIA dark flight and brought back and placed in the equivalent of a black site on U.S. territory.
What does that mean for somebody like me or other reporters who aren't very powerful or aren't very well known, who might come across some information like this?
This is the warning. If you attempt to shine a light into the inner workings of power, this is what's going to happen. And if anyone thinks this is going to end with Julian Assange, then they understand nothing about despotic power, or they haven't read any history.
Right. So basically, if you're a powerless journalist who's just a reporter doing their job, you don't have a huge organization behind you, you could wind up doing your job right into a federal prison for the rest of your life.
Well, that's right, but I think we should be clear that they intend to go after any journalist, even if they do have an organization behind them. And the fact that they are willing to deform law to go after someone who is not a U.S. citizen and whose news organization is not based in the United States. I mean, how can this guy be charged with the Espionage Act, which is the equivalent of our version of the British Foreign Secrets Act, which is about an American, a U.S. citizen, passing secret information, potentially damaging information to a hostile power. It's an utter corruption and misuse of the Espionage Act. They tried to use it against Daniel Ellsberg. Obama used it against a series of whistleblowers, I think 8 or 9 times, Kiriakou, Edward Snowden, and others. But it's a reinterpretation of law by judicial fiat, which is nothing new. The Supreme Court has been doing that with Citizens United and, the right to privacy and everything else. But it's just another example of the corruption of the rule of law, which is essentially creates the bulwark for tyranny when law no longer is able to constrain the actions of power.
Very interesting. Anything you'd like to add?
This is extremely important, which is why I'm going to fly to London for that week and report on it and write on it. And I may even visit Julian if I can get in. It's very, very important and momentous in terms of a benchmark exposing the assault of the press and the inability of free press to do its job.
Former New York Times reporter Chris Hedges. Hedges says he'll travel to London next month to support Julian Assange as he fights extradition to the United States. And back to impeachment news. The Trump administration and the leaders of the House impeachment inquiry clashed Tuesday over Democrats' demands to depose State Department officials who are witnesses in their growing investigation. Both sides accused each other of underhanded tactics. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo pushed back, saying the effort amounted to an act of intimidation and did not allow enough time for the State Department to properly respond. The chairman of the House Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Oversight and Reform Committees, who have scheduled the confidential interviews, scoffed at the suggestion, saying Pompeo was the intimidator. House Intelligence Chair Adam Schiff reminded Pompeo not cooperating with Congress could be a crime. Pompeo didn't outright refuse to allow the State Department employees to answer House investigators' questions about the actions of Trump and his personal lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani. The questions are at the heart of the whistleblowers' complaint, detailing attempts by Trump to pressure Ukraine's leaders to help smear former Vice President Joseph Biden, using Giuliani as spearhead. Trump, in an angry round of Twitter posts, suggested that Schiff, Democrat of California, should be arrested. But Trump saved most of his apparent bile for the whistleblower, demanding he should be allowed to interview the person. The identity of the whistleblower has remained a secret. Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa, the senior-most Senate Republican and a longtime champion of whistleblower laws, responded forcefully, saying the government and the news media should always work to respect whistleblowers' requests for confidentiality. He did not explicitly mention Trump. With all the demands to protect or reveal the whistleblower's identity and calls for respecting their privacy, commentator Norman Solomon, executive director of the Institute for Public Policy, says political leaders have forgotten whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, who have been either jailed or forced into exile. Solomon says it's a double standard.
Just as we need overall a single standard of human rights, we need a single standard of support for whistleblowers, and that includes so-called national security whistleblowers. So, for instance, when Edward Snowden surfaced in Hong Kong and provided his tremendous public service to expose the shredding of the Fourth Amendment with mass surveillance by the U.S. National Security Agency, we had, for instance, then Secretary of State John Kerry, working for the Obama administration, publicly proclaiming that Snowden was, quote, a traitor, unquote. Well, this tells you a lot about the Democratic Party establishment view of whistleblowing when it goes up against the military-industrial intelligence complex. Very recently now, with this uproar about the now unidentified whistleblower who exposed the very improper phone call that Trump had with Ukraine's president, we've had, I think, quite appropriate praise of that whistleblowing, but we have the online action group Move On, which claims an email list of 8 million people expressing support for that whistleblower and actually joining with an organization that is helping to defend that whistleblower, which is quite good, except that organization actually opposes the rights of people like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning and Jeffrey Sterling and other national security whistleblowers. You've got this ostensibly progressive organization, MoveOn.org, supporting a position that says if a whistleblower goes outside of the official channels and actually provides information to journalists, then that's not really whistleblowing and does not deserve legal protection. That's outrageous and really cuts against the basic concept of whistleblowing for the informed consent of the governed. It's a position that would say, for instance, Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower, therefore would have no right to a legal defense and would have no rights as a whistleblower. So this is a contradiction that exists right now. It's better to put it out in the open because otherwise we're going to have essentially de facto two categories of whistleblowers, the good ones and the so-called bad ones, the ones that will be praised because they work within channels and they don't go to the press and they are in sync with the Democratic Party positions, and we'll have the ones who are tarred and denigrated and often prosecuted and thrown in prison.
We are seeing this separation out of two types of whistleblower. What is the difference? What is making the difference right now?
The basic difference is whether the whistleblower, as a so-called national security one, challenges the establishment that is waging endless war, that is profiteering with billions of dollars in Pentagon and intel contracts, and that is part of the war machinery, the surveillance machinery, and the overall process by which the U.S. government operates 800 overseas military bases and does enormous damage to civil liberties with routine mass surveillance and so forth. So you've got some very courageous whistleblowers who have been willing and able through working in the military or NSA or CIA. They've been willing and able to provide that information to journalists. And those are the folks who are, I believe, very much in need of support, but get very little from the mass media, and as I mentioned, don't even get support from a group like Move On.
What's wrong with the whistleblowing laws and protections that we have? Is there anything broken that could be fixed?
There's virtually no protections in federal law for whistleblowers in the so-called national security area. So, for instance, Daniel Ellsberg, when he was put on trial for leaking the Pentagon Papers, the judge did not allow him to testify as to why he provided the public through media with the Pentagon Papers, the reasons why he did it. That's true under the Espionage Act, which is now 100 years old, that's been used against national security whistleblowers. It's true of that law and the way it's being applied. Ultimately, yes, it is a problem with laws. It's ultimately a political problem, because as long as you have basically a bipartisan view that will praise certain whistleblowers in certain circumscribed contexts, if it suits narrow partisan interests, but condemns whistleblowers who really challenge government secrecy and militarism, as long as you have this tremendous hypocrisy built into not only the partisan arena but the mass media, we're going to have the situation we have right now. I mean, Chelsea Manning is in prison right now after 7 years behind bars, but Chelsea's back in prison now because of a very principled stand to not testify before a grand jury against WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. How often do you see in the news media any reference to Chelsea Manning now? You don't see it, you don't hear it. How often have you seen an editorial or a column in the New York Times defending Manning? It just doesn't hardly ever happen, and this tells you how corrupted the corporate media are and how much work we have to do to change this entire situation.
If you can't say why I did it because this was going to happen, what is it they're looking for then when you can, if there is a case when you can do this?
What the prosecutors are looking for is the railroad to get you to prison and keep you in prison for quite a while. And that's really the kangaroo court aspect of the whole setup. When Snowden emerged from his whistleblowing, went public, not only did you have Secretary of State John Kerry calling him a traitor, you also had people like Kerry and someone who said he was not a traitor but still should be prosecuted, Nancy Pelosi at the time. They all, with a chorus of other government officials of both parties, they said, oh, Snowden should come back to the United States and face trial. What they really meant is they wanted to come back and be railroaded into prison, be treated the way that Chelsea Manning was, put in solitary in conditions that a UN investigator said conditions that were tantamount to torture through extreme deprivation, sensory deprivation, and isolation in solitary. There is no justice for those sorts of courageous whistleblowers who go outside channels to really provide the public with information that we need in a democracy.
What do you think is going to happen to this whistleblower?
My crystal ball is in the shop. I don't know. I think that on the one hand, you have a vicious administration run by a very megalomaniac nut named Donald Trump, being backed up by the vast majority of Republicans in Congress. And the Trump administration, of course, has control over the so-called Justice Department. So in that way, it's hazardous for this whistleblower, we're told is from the CIA. We don't know that for sure. Apparently, it is someone in the intelligence arena. I don't like the phrase intelligence community. We don't know how far the Trump regime will be able to push to vindictively punish that whistleblower. On the other hand, that whistleblower is a darling of most of the media, with Fox and the right-wing media accepted. So it's really hard to tell what will happen to that individual.
Norman Solomon is Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy and National Coordinator of RootsAction.org. That's RootsAction.org.